In this two-part lecture, we'll spruce up some of the visuals in our game. Now that we have the core mechanics of our game actually built out, before we move on and juice up some of the extra additional factors, let's actually take some time to update the visual look of our game. I think we can first tackle some basic post-processing in our scene. So over here in our hierarchy, we actually have our global volume game object, and on this game object, we have a volume component. By default, the volume component should still have this sample scene profile selected in this main field. If you click this, you can actually see where it's located in our settings folder. If for whatever reason you're actually not seeing the post-processing in your game view, you're just going to want to go over and toggle on the post-processing field on your main camera. So main camera, scrolling down to rendering, and then just making sure that this post-processing is ticked on, or else you won't actually see the post-processing changes happening at all in your game view. I tend to not actually like seeing the post-processing effects in my scene view, so I usually actually keep the post-processing effects in my scene view off. You can turn that off in our scene view by actually toggling this drop down here and unticking post-processing. And depending on the type of game that I'm working on, I'll also toggle off fog and the skybox just to keep my scene view as clean as possible. With that turned off in our scene view, let's go back over to our global volume and actually start modifying some of our global volume overrides. From top to bottom, we have our bloom override, although at the moment, we don't actually have a whole lot of emissive materials going on in our scene. We can go ahead and adjust that shortly. Scrolling down a bit, the next one we see is motion blur. I'm going to leave this off for this project. We can actually just go ahead and delete this override entirely. I do like a nice vignette, however. I'm actually going to ramp my intensity up quite a bit for this project. Maybe around something like 0.4 looks good to me. To increase the overall brightness of our game, as well as shift around a few colors, I tend to also add a color adjustments override. We can naturally increase the post exposure of our game just a tad without actually having to affect our directional light. One helpful thing to note is we can actually modify these overrides while we're in play mode. Since we're actually just modifying the sample scene profile that's attached to the global volume, we can actually modify these values while we're in play mode, and it will actually save when we exit play mode. So let's go ahead and do that. We can see our alignment on our canvas isn't working properly. No worries, it's just because we're in pause mode, but let's go ahead and modify some of these overrides. For my game, I'd actually like to increase the contrast a little bit. I think it'll just kind of make our entire game pop a bit more. So I'm going to increase my contrast to say something like 9 for now. On top of that, I'm also just going to ever so slightly shift up the saturation. Nothing too drastic, but probably somewhere around here looks pretty good to me. I'm going to go ahead and unpause my game for a little bit just so we can actually get a few obstacles in our scene. Another override that I would like to add is the bokeh effect. So what is that called? That is the depth of field effect. Instead of using the Gaussian mode, I do find this easier to adjust because it just has a start and an end mode. I do tend to actually like the bokeh effect a little bit more. It can be a little bit trickier to manage some of these properties. It's very similar to operating, say, like a DSLR camera, for example, since we're actually modifying the aperture property and whatnot. But I do find the end effect a little bit more appealing to my eye. So let's get this situated roughly where I want it. I think I'm going to need to toggle on the focus distance, the focal length, and the aperture. I think we can go ahead and ignore these bottom three. For the focus distance, I'm keeping my eye way over here on these obstacles by my checkpoint. For the focal distance, I'm going to actually want that somewhere around probably 3 to 4. I think we're going to need to modify the focal length and the aperture first. So focal length, probably somewhere around there. There you go. You can actually see it starting to blur at the very background. And my aperture around something like 5 to 6 looks pretty good. And focus distance probably somewhere around 3 to 4. For me, I think that looks pretty good. We've got a little bit of blurring way off into the distance. Now, there are a lot of other overrides that you could add, but for now, I'm pretty satisfied to move on. I tend to like to change my tone mapping mode setting from neutral to aces. This is just a bit of a personal preference, but I do like the visual aesthetic that it gives my game. Next up, let's actually modify some of our rendering settings. So over here in our assets folder, over to our settings, we can actually modify this PC_RP asset. I believe this is actually where before, several lectures ago, we modified the depth and the normal bias on our shadows, so we didn't kind of get that shadow tearing. At the moment, our max distance for rendering shadows is 50 Unity units. You can probably actually see that here, just way off into the distance. I don't think we can quite see the shadows rendering properly on some of those game objects. So we know our game is never going to be longer than I think 120 units because each individual chunk is 10 long. So I'm just going to go ahead and change my max distance to say something like 150, just to make sure that shadows are always rendering in my game. Depending on not only your computer, but the platform that you're actually planning on releasing a game like this to, some of these settings might not work as properly on different sorts of platforms. For example, your mileage may vary a lot when actually publishing a game to mobile, for example. But for our purposes, I'm pretty satisfied to tinker around with some of these settings. Scrolling up a tad, we have a shadows, we have a lighting window, we also have this quality dropdown. You can see a lot of hard edges on a lot of our models. I'm actually going to change my anti-aliasing drop-down option all the way from disabled to the maximum, which is 8x. I tend to prefer this look here. Everything is already starting to look a lot smoother. Next up, let's actually pop over to my directional light. Now this, on the other hand, we're not actually going to be able to change these settings directly in play mode. We're going to make sure that we actually want to save the values and then once again copy and paste these values once we exit play mode, so let's be cognizant of that. But I would like to actually change the rotation of my directional light a little bit. You can see that the current direction of my shadows is just kind of lining up with the model here. I'm going to actually angle it off to the left a little bit and probably just bring that in a tad. Somewhere around there I think looks quite nice. So to save this rotational setting, if you were to exit play mode right now, it's actually just going to snap back to where it was. I'm going to actually go ahead and right click this rotation property over in our transform component. You can either copy the Euler angles or quaternion. I feel like it would actually do the same thing when I pasted it back in, to be honest. But for safety, I'm just going to go ahead and copy the Euler angles, which is this X, Y, and Z value. Unpause, and then once again, right-click rotation, and then say paste Euler angles. There we go. We've got our shadows rendering in the right direction. But you can see on my view, my shadows are just a little bit blocky, almost like our shadows are just a little bit jagged. So scrolling down to our directional light, you find this shadows dropdown. I do want to render soft shadows, but I can actually change somewhere here soft shadow from low to high. I think this higher quality shadow effect looks quite nice on my computer. I'm going to also just maybe bring my strength down just a tad, something to 0.95, nothing too drastic. Because we changed the direction of our directional light, it kind of looks like our main player, in other words, the king model, isn't quite as bright as I would like. Well, the king is kind of the star of the show, so I'm actually going to add an additional point light behind the king just to really brighten up our main subject. So on our player here, let's actually just go ahead and right click and create a point light. So let's find light and find a point light. Let's go ahead and make sure that's zeroed out, and we can just kind of adjust that properly somewhere behind the king. With it childed to our player, it will just always naturally follow our king no matter where we go. So let's see, I'm just going to actually try to drag that up to about there. You can just kind of see that shining on the back of its head. Up the intensity just a little bit, nothing too drastic. Probably shrink down the range a little bit. I don't really want it affecting anything else other than the king. Something around there looks quite nice. You can kind of see as I toggle off and on that light, it actually does make a pretty big drastic difference. I think that helps our king, kind of the main subject of our game, just really pop out at the very center of the view. Now, I am noticing we're actually once again doing this in play mode. So none of these settings are actually going to change, including the entire game object that we've created in play mode. So one little trick that you can actually do is highlight the point light, press Control-C, that will actually copy this entire game object. That way, when we actually exit play mode, we can actually go over to our hierarchy. It doesn't really matter what's actually selected. We can just go ahead and paste that point light back in, and then just once again, child it to our player. That way, we're actually getting the entire game object and all of the components with the values that we had set up while we were in play mode. Now, pretty soon, we're going to actually implement a really cool particle system sort of fog effect to kind of hide the obstacles off in the distance. But before we do that, there's a little bit of a halfway point. We can open up our lighting tab. So window, I can never remember where it is. Let's find it in rendering and lighting. There we go. I'm actually going to go ahead and take this lighting tab and then just dock it over here by my inspector. On the third tab over on environment, we can actually click on this other settings fog. That will just kind of give us, at the moment, at least some very natural fog, just kind of way off into the distance on all of our game objects. You can actually see nothing is being portrayed outside of our game objects. So let's change this color just to a nice natural dark blue. I don't actually think these settings are going to change inside of play mode. I'm pretty sure they're going to change when we exit play mode, actually. But annoyingly, you actually can't right-click this component to save these properties. So we're just going to actually have to remember some of the fields that we change. Maybe something even between dark blue to dark purple to kind of match the aesthetic of our king, somewhere around there. It's a lot easier to set up the linear properties just because we actually have a start and an end value. But same thing here, I tend to have more success getting the overall aesthetic and look that I like using exponential squared. Now I am noticing, I think we actually made a mistake. I think my shadow settings got once again jagged and blurred because we were in play mode. I'm catching myself making a little bit of a slip up here. We're going to have to go back and change some of those shadow settings when I'm outside of play mode, but let's go ahead and tackle our fog first. You can see the fog way off into the distance, but our density value is just super duper low. If you ramp that to anything even slightly too high, it's just going to look super overwhelming very quickly. So let's change this to something like 0.02. Yeah, I think something like that looks pretty good. Okay, let's go ahead and exit play mode and see if this saved. I don't believe it will. So toggle back on fog and blue somewhere in between blue to purple, probably somewhere around there. Don't need to be too picky about it. And then just changing our density to 0.02. And while it's on my mind, let's toggle back to our directional light and fix those shadows that I think got toggled off. Yep, there we go. So soft shadow from low back to high. Let's go ahead and hit play and just see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that looks quite nice. And you could turn your strength down. I think before I even had it to 0.95. Yeah, you know what? I do think I like that. So let's change it to something like 0.95. Super duper subtle. And you know what? We're already looking a lot better. There's a couple other small subtle changes I'd like to make. With some of the settings we've changed, I think my overall lighting is a little bit too low, so changing my intensity from 2 to say something like maybe 2.7-ish. Yeah, I think that looks about right. So exiting play mode and once again just putting in that value, 2.7 on my directional light intensity. I think one cool thing we could do to add to the ambiance of this game is on each individual lamp post, just add another additional point light. We'll tackle that in part 2 of this lecture. When you're ready to move on, I'll see you there.